Hey everyone, and welcome back. We're doing a deep dive today into something that might seem a little bit intimidating at first. How countries can end up in financial trouble. We'll be looking at excerpts from Ray Dalio's book, How Countries Go Broke.
Okay.
And one of the really interesting things about Dalio is that he's not just like an economist.
Right.
He's also a hugely successful investor who uses these same ideas to make investment decisions.
Interesting.
So there's some practical stuff in here for us to uncover.
What I find so interesting is that Dalio really connects the dots between how people act with their money and the things whole countries do.
Right.
He says that just like when people overspend on their credit cards, countries can get into a debt squeeze if they borrow more than they can pay back.
So it's not just about like numbers and budgets. There's like a human side to it too.
Yeah.
Dalio calls this pattern the big debt cycle. And what's really wild is that he's found that these cycles have been going on for centuries, often leading to like the downfall of empires.
Yeah, Dalio's research shows that these cycles aren't just random things that happen.
Right.
It's about changes in how people think, what governments do, and the shifts in global power. If we can understand these cycles, we might be able to see risks coming and make smarter choices about our money.
Okay, so how does this big debt cycle actually play out?
Yeah.
Dalio breaks it down into 5 stages.
He does.
Right.
He starts with what he calls sound money.
Okay.
It's the ideal situation.
Right.
When debt isn't too high, growth is healthy, and things are going well.
It's kind of like the Goldilocks phase of a country's finances.
Yeah.
Not too hot, not too cold. Everything's just right.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But then things start to get a little too good.
Oh.
We enter this second stage, the debt bubble. All of a sudden, credit's really easy to get.
Yeah.
And it's super cheap.
Right.
This encourages people to take risks and speculate, which drives up asset prices to crazy levels.
Yeah.
Think about the dot-com bubble back in the late 90s.
Yeah.
That's a perfect example of this stage.
Yeah, that was a time when everyone was super excited and speculating like crazy. Companies that weren't even making money were worth billions of dollars.
Right.
It felt like the party would never end.
It did, though.
Yeah, it did.
All bubbles eventually burst.
They do.
Leading us to stage 3, the top.
Yeah.
The music stops, things change, and the economy takes a dip.
Right.
Credit gets tighter, asset prices fall, and the party's officially over. But it doesn't just go back to normal.
Yeah.
It starts a chain reaction that leads to a difficult process Dalio calls deleveraging.
And this is where things get really messy, huh?
Yeah, unfortunately.
Yeah.
Stage 4, this deleveraging, is when all that excessive debt really comes back to bite.
Right.
Debt burdens get too heavy, and you start to see defaults, restructurings, and sometimes even currencies losing their value. It's a time of big economic and political instability.
Right.
Kind of like we saw during the 2008 financial crisis.
Right. So we've got this buildup of debt,
Yeah.
a bubble that pops,
Right.
and then this painful unwinding of all that leverage.
Right.
But then what happens?
Eventually, things settle down,
Okay.
and we get to stage 5, a new beginning.
Okay.
A new economic order starts to form and sets the stage for the whole cycle to start over again.
So it's not just going forward in a straight line.
No.
It's a cycle that keeps repeating throughout history.
It does.
Yeah.
And while each cycle might have its own unique details,
Right.
the basic patterns stay pretty much the same.
Okay, so we've got this big picture view of how these debt cycles work.
Mm-hmm.
But where do central banks fit into all of this?
Yeah.
They're supposed to keep things stable financially, right?
They are, but central banks have a really important role in managing these cycles.
Yeah.
But how much they actually influence things is up for debate. They try to keep everything running smoothly.
Right.
But sometimes the things they do can actually make the problem worse.
It's like trying to steer a huge ship in a storm, but the waves just keep getting bigger.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Central banks use this thing called monetary policy to try and control the cycle.
Okay.
Early on, they can change interest rates to affect how much people borrow and spend.
Right.
But as debt levels go up,
Mm-hmm.
they often have to do more drastic things,
Like what?
like printing more money
Okay.
and buying up government debt, which is called debt monetization.
This brings up a question a lot of people have. Could a country, even a really powerful one, actually go broke?
Mm-hmm.
And if so, how?
Technically, a country that controls its own currency can't really go bankrupt in the usual way.
Okay.
It can always print more money to pay off its debts.
Right.
However,
there's always an economics, right? What's the catch?
the problem is that printing too much money causes inflation,
Right.
which makes savings and investments worth less. Think about what happened in Weimar Germany, or more recently, Venezuela.
Right. Those are really good examples of what can happen when a country's finances spiral out of control.
Exactly.
Yeah.
While printing money might seem like a quick solution,
Right.
it ultimately makes the whole economy less stable.
So it sounds like figuring out where we are in this big debt cycle is crucial.
It is.
But how do we do that? What signs should we be looking for?
Well, one key indicator Dalio talks about is the debt-to-income ratio.
Okay.
This basically compares how much debt a country has to how much money it's bringing in.
Okay.
As this ratio goes up, it gets harder to manage that debt without taking on even more.
Yeah.
Which can create a kind of vicious cycle.
Yeah, it's like trying to outrun your own shadow.
Right.
The faster you run, the faster it chases you.
Exactly. Another important factor is how interest rates stack up against economic growth.
Okay.
If interest rates are higher than the rate of economic growth,
Right.
it means the debt's growing faster than the economy can keep up with.
Got it. So it's not just the total amount of debt.
Yeah.
It's also how quickly it's growing compared to the economy's ability to handle it.
That's exactly right. And then there's this thing called debt service relative to income.
Right.
Debt service is basically the payments you got to make to cover both the interest and the principal on all that outstanding debt.
Right.
It's not just about the overall size of the debt, but also how much you're forking over every year just to stay afloat.
So it's like trying to manage your household budget.
Yeah.
When most of your income is going towards paying off credit cards and loans.
Yeah, a great analogy.
Doesn't leave much room for anything else.
And finally, Dalio really emphasizes how important a country's savings or reserves are compared to its debt level.
Right.
If a country's got a big stash of savings, it acts like a cushion against any unexpected economic shocks.
Right, like an emergency fund.
Exactly like an emergency fund for a rainy day.
But if a country has used up all its savings and it's deep in debt, it's going to be really vulnerable to any economic crisis that comes along.
Absolutely. By looking at all these indicators, we can kind of get a sense of how healthy a country's finances are.
Right.
And whether they're on a sustainable track.
Okay, so let's bring this back to the U.S. now.
Sure.
We know that the U.S. has a lot of debt.
It does.
Based on Dalio's framework. Where do you think we stand in this big debt cycle?
It's tough to say for sure.
Right.
But considering everything we've been talking about, it seems like the U.S. is probably in the later stages of the cycle.
Okay.
The debt-to-income ratio has been going up for decades.
Right.
Interest rates have been kept artificially low.
Yeah.
And the government keeps running these budget deficits.
That doesn't sound very reassuring.
It is a bit concerning.
Yeah.
But remember, these cycles can take a long time to play out.
Okay.
It doesn't necessarily mean a financial crisis is right around the corner.
So we have some time to figure things out.
Yeah, we do.
But what steps can we take to, reduce the risk and put the U.S. on a more, solid financial path?
Well, there are a few options, but they usually involve some tough political decisions.
Right.
One option is what's called austerity measures.
Okay.
Which basically means cutting back on government spending.
That sounds pretty painful, though.
It can be.
No one wants to see important programs get cut.
You're right. Austerity measures can be unpopular.
Yeah.
And they can even make things worse if they lead to a sudden economic downturn.
Okay, so what else is there?
Another option is trying to boost economic growth,
right,
which would increase tax revenue and make it easier to manage the debt.
So finding ways to make the economy grow faster to help lighten the burden.
It would.
Yeah.
But achieving sustainable economic growth is tricky.
Yeah.
There's no easy fix for that.
Okay, so we have austerity, which is tough, and boosting growth, which is also hard to do. Are there any other options? What about this debt restructuring thing that Dalio talks about?
Debt restructuring basically means renegotiating the terms of existing debt.
Okay.
Like extending the repayment periods.
Yeah.
Or lowering interest rates.
Got it.
It's a way to try and make the debt load more manageable.
So it's kind of like going back to the bank and asking for a better deal on your mortgage.
In a way, yes.
Yeah.
But debt restructuring can get complicated.
Right.
And it can affect a country's creditworthiness.
It sounds like there are no easy answers here.
No, not really.
All of these options have downsides and trade-offs.
That's the challenge with dealing with national debt.
Yeah.
It often means making tough decisions and trying to balance competing goals.
Okay, so we've talked about the risks of too much debt and some possible ways to deal with it.
Right.
But Dalio also mentions that these debt cycles can create investment opportunities, right? How does that work?
Good point. While debt crises can be really bad for a lot of people, they can also create opportunities for investors who understand what's going on.
Okay.
For example, during a deleveraging phase,
Right.
asset prices often plummet.
Yeah.
This can be a chance to buy assets at a discount for those who think the market has overreacted.
So it's like finding those hidden gems that everyone else is overlooking?
Exactly, because they're too busy panicking.
Yeah.
Another strategy is to invest in things that tend to do well when there's inflation, like gold or real estate.
Makes sense if printing money is one way to try and manage a debt crisis.
Right.
Those assets would hold their value better than a currency that's losing its buying power.
You got it.
Yeah.
But investing during times of economic trouble is risky.
Of course.
It takes careful analysis, risk management, and a long-term outlook.
So it's not just about blindly throwing money at anything that looks like a good deal.
Yep.
You need to understand how the market works and have a plan for dealing with the risks.
Absolutely. And I think that's one of the key takeaways from Dalio's work. Whether you're an investor, a policymaker, or just someone who cares about what's going on.
Yeah.
Understanding these cycles can help you make better choices and maybe even take advantage of opportunities that others miss.
All right, so we've covered a lot today.
We have.
The mechanics of these debt cycles, the warning signs of a potential crisis, and some possible solutions.
Right.
But Dalio also digs into the historical context of these cycles. What can we learn from looking back at history?
History is full of examples of nations rising and falling, often tied to these same debt cycles we've been discussing.
Okay.
Dalio gives us a bunch of interesting case studies that show these patterns and the consequences we've talked about.
All right, so let's hop in the time machine.
Okay.
What are some of the historical examples that really stood out to you?
One really striking example is the rise and fall of the British Empire in the 19th century.
Right.
Britain was the top dog.
Yeah.
Economically and militarily. Their currency, the pound sterling, was the global reserve currency.
So kind of like the U.S. dollar is today.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But as Britain kept racking up debt to fund their empire and wars, their economic power started to weaken. By the early 20th century, the pound sterling wasn't as important anymore.
Yeah.
And Britain's power on the world stage had shrunk.
It's a classic example of how too much debt can weaken a nation.
Yeah.
Even one as powerful as the British Empire.
Right.
What other examples does Dalio talk about?
Another one that comes to mind is the Weimar Republic in Germany.
Okay.
Back in the 1920s.
Right.
After World War I, Germany was stuck with huge war reparations, and their economy was a mess to try and cope.
Yeah.
The government just started printing tons of money, which led to hyperinflation.
Right.
It was total chaos, economically and socially.
Yeah.
Prices skyrocketed, savings were wiped out.
Wow.
And their currency became practically worthless.
It's a crazy example of what can happen when inflation gets out of control.
Yeah.
I remember reading about people needing wheelbarrows full of cash just to buy a loaf of bread.
It was wild.
Yeah.
These historical examples, along with a bunch of others Dalio looks at, prove that these cycles aren't anything new.
Right.
They've been happening for centuries.
Right.
And often with really bad consequences.
Okay, so we've seen how these debt cycles have played out in the past.
Yeah.
But why do they keep happening? Is it just like human nature to go overboard and then have to deal with the fallout?
That's definitely part of it.
Okay.
Dalio points out that these cycles are driven by a few things.
Okay.
Like psychological biases, political pressure, and just the way credit and debt work.
So it's not just bad luck or bad decisions.
No.
There are like deeper forces at work here.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Let's start with these psychological biases.
Okay.
One big one is something economists call short-termism.
Okay.
It means people, even policymakers, often focus on what they want right now.
Right.
Instead of thinking about the long-term consequences.
Okay.
They take that extra slice of cake.
Right.
Even though they know it's not good for them down the road.
Yeah. When it comes to debt,
yeah,
this short-term thinking can lead to too much borrowing and spending.
Right.
Especially when credit is easy and cheap to get.
Exactly.
It's like those buy now, pay later deals.
Right.
They make it so easy to spend more than you should.
They do.
Yeah.
Another bias is overconfidence.
Okay.
When the economy is booming, people tend to get super optimistic about the future.
Right.
And underestimate the risks.
Okay.
They start thinking nothing can go wrong.
Right.
and the good times will last forever.
It's like that feeling you get when you're winning at the casino.
Yeah.
You start thinking you're invincible.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And that overconfidence can lead to these speculative bubbles.
Right.
Where asset prices get way out of line with what they're actually worth.
Yeah.
Eventually, those bubbles pop and reality sets back in.
So we've got these psychological biases pushing us towards short-term thinking. But what about those political pressures you mentioned?
Yeah, governments often feel pressure to boost the economy and keep unemployment low.
Yeah.
Especially in democracies where there are regular elections.
Right.
This can create an incentive to keep things going well, even if it means taking on more debt.
So there's this conflict between what's good for politicians in the short term and what's good for the country financially in the long term.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Politicians often focus on those short-term economic gains rather than thinking about long-term financial stability.
And that's where the whole credit and debt thing comes in.
Right.
Like we said before, credit creates debt.
It does.
And if that debt isn't managed carefully, it can grow really fast.
It's like a snowball rolling downhill, getting bigger and bigger.
As the debt levels increase, it gets harder and harder to manage it without borrowing even more. Exactly. Which just keeps the cycle going.
It does. So you have these psychological biases, political pressures, and the nature of debt itself, all working together to create these repeating patterns.
Yeah. It's a pretty potent combination.
Yeah.
It helps explain why we see these debt cycles over and over again throughout history.
Exactly. And that's why Dalio says understanding all of this is so important for navigating the global economy.
Okay, so we've explored how these debt cycles work, historical context, and the factors that drive them. What does all this mean for the future?
Right.
Are we just going to keep making the same mistakes?
Not necessarily. Dalio believes that if we can understand these cycles and see the warning signs, we can make better decisions and maybe even reduce the risks.
So it's not about trying to predict the future, but about being ready for different possibilities.
That's it. By studying history, being aware of our own biases, and understanding how credit and debt work.
Right.
We can hopefully handle these cycles better than we have in the past.
That's a good point. It's not like we're helpless against these cycles.
Right.
We can learn from history and make smarter choices.
We can.
Both as individuals and as a society.
Absolutely. We're not just watching this happen.
Right.
We can actually shape our economic future if we understand the forces at play.
That's a great takeaway for our listeners.
I think so.
We've covered a lot today. From the basics of credit and debt. To the historical context and some possible solutions. And the main point Dalio seems to be making is that understanding these cycles can help us make better decisions.
It can.
Both in our own lives and as a country.
It can help everyone.
Yeah.
Whether you're an investor looking for opportunities, a policymaker trying to manage the economy, or just a regular person trying to make sense of what's happening.
Right.
This knowledge is really valuable.
So the next time you hear about rising national debt, or a possible financial crisis. Remember that there are historical patterns at work. By understanding those patterns, we can hopefully avoid making the same mistakes and create a more stable and prosperous future.
That's the goal.
Thanks for joining us for this deep dive into the world of national debt.
Of course.
We hope you found it insightful and empowering.
Me too.
Until next time, keep learning and stay curious.